They didn't erase it because it was irrelevant. They erased it because it was powerful, because it carried truths that couldn't be controlled, because it spoke to the soul in a way that could not be institutionalized. The Ethiopian Bible wasn't just a book. It was a blueprint, a mirror reflecting a people's wisdom, identity, and sacred connection. It held texts older than the versions the world came to know. It told stories that weren't watered down. And that kind of authenticity, that scares systems built on selective truth. What happens when a people know who they are? Spiritually, historically, divinely. They stop begging for permission. They stop waiting for validation. They rise. When 99.9% of something is erased, you've got to ask why. What was in those pages that someone didn't want us to see? Because real erasure isn't about forgetting, it's about control. Erase the roots, and you make the tree easier to break. Erase the history, and you confuse the present. Erase the power, and people forget they ever had it. But no matter how much is hidden, truth has a rhythm. It echoes in the ancestors. It survives in the language, in the music, in the traditions. It lives in every heartbeat that refuses to forget. And today, more than ever, the veil is lifting. People are waking up, asking questions, opening books that were never meant to be opened again. Not to rebel, but to remember. Because the more you uncover, the more you realize you were never lost. You were hidden, buried under generations of silence, filtered through someone else's lens. But the fire never went out. It just waited for you. This isn't about rewriting faith. It's about reclaiming what was always yours. It's about not settling for half the story. When you were born to carry the full truth, you were never meant to survive on spiritual crumbs. You come from a table that once fed nations with wisdom, prophecy, and divine connection. That's why they tried to erase it. But now the erased are remembering. Now the voices once silenced are starting to speak. Loud, clear, unshaken. And if you're hearing this, it's not by accident. You're part of the remembering. You are the living continuation of a truth that refuses to die. You are the spark, the page that couldn't be torn, the verse that echoes in every act of awareness, every step toward truth. They tried to erase 99.9%, but they didn't erase you. And as long as you're here, the story lives. When history is rewritten, when texts are redacted, when stories are buried, it is rarely about clarification. It is almost never about improving understanding. Instead, it is nearly always about control. Control of the narrative, control of the people, control of the future. The erasure of nearly all of the Ethiopian Bible isn't a simple footnote in the story of global history. It's a loud and deliberate decision made by those who understood the immense power of knowledge, culture, and self-awareness. The Ethiopian Bible, more expansive and older than the commonly accepted versions, contains stories, wisdom, and cultural identity markers that ran counter to the prevailing narratives pushed by empires and institutions. It offered a version of the human experience that didn't align with the power structures of the time. Stories where the origins of civilization were African, where the wisdom was deeply rooted in the soil of ancient traditions, and where dignity and legacy were inherent in people who had been taught to forget it. The decision to eliminate these texts, to keep them hidden, and to minimize their impact wasn't about preserving truth, it was about preserving influence. Systems built on centralized authority are threatened by decentralized knowledge. When people have access to broader truths, truths that connect them to ancient wisdom, intellectual greatness, and unshakable dignity, they are far less likely to be controlled. They begin to think critically. They begin to ask questions. They stop depending on intermediaries to define their value or shape their path. That's what made the Ethiopian Bible dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was whole. Because it challenged the narrative that wisdom and progress only flowed from one direction. It disrupted the image of a people portrayed as voiceless, storyless, and powerless. And so it had to be quieted. Erasure is a tool of domination. It isn't loud. It doesn't always burn books in public. Often it happens in silence, in meetings behind closed doors, in subtle shifts of curriculum, in the omission of key ideas. Erasure strips communities of the pride that comes from knowing their story is deeper, older, and richer than they've been told. It reduces them to fragments of themselves, trapped in a version of history where they were only ever acted upon, never the actors. But here's the thing about suppression: it's never permanent. Truth may be hidden, but it is never destroyed. Fragments survive, echoes remain. A curious mind can still find its way back through the noise, piecing together what was meant to be lost. The Ethiopian Bible, despite all efforts, still exists. It still whispers to those willing to listen. It still challenges those willing to think beyond borders and boundaries. This isn't about religion. It's about the right to know where you come from. It's about cultural autonomy, intellectual freedom, and the refusal to accept a world shaped entirely by someone else's version of events. It's about reclaiming what was taken, not to hold on to the past, but to walk into the future with clarity and pride. When a text is erased, it's not because it lacks value, it's because it holds too much. The Ethiopian Bible represented more than faith. It represented ownership of story, of voice, of legacy. That kind of power, when taken away, makes people dependent. When returned, it makes them unstoppable. We must remember that erasure doesn't begin with facts. It begins with fear. Fear that people, if given access to the full story, will rise above the roles they've been assigned. Fear that they will see through the illusion. Fear that they will stop asking for permission to exist with pride and start living as if they always had that right, because they did. So ask the questions. Dig deeper. Don't accept the surface. The truth is still there between the lines, beneath the edits, beyond the silence. You're not looking for perfection. You're looking for the pieces that still live. Because once you understand the erasure wasn't meant to correct anything, but to control everything, you realize your freedom starts with remembering what was never supposed to be forgotten. History doesn't vanish just because it's hidden. It doesn't cease to exist because it's not written in a book or taught in a classroom. The absence of documentation does not equal the absence of truth. When history is buried, it may become harder to access, but it doesn't disappear. It waits quietly, patiently, often in the hearts and minds of people who refuse to forget. And that's the remarkable power of human resilience, even when forced into silence. People find ways to remember. Ancient texts once preserved on scrolls, stone tablets, or parchment may have been burned, banned, or rewritten, but their essence lives on in oral traditions passed from generation to generation. In many cultures, especially those whose histories were excluded or erased from dominant narratives, oral storytelling became the library of truth. Grandmothers became the archivists. Elders became the historians. Songs, proverbs, dances, rituals, all carried fragments of a history the world told them to forget. These living traditions became vessels for identity. They carried wisdom, law, morality, and memory. In places where literacy was not permitted or where written records were destroyed, these cultural expressions endured. They became coded survival. Stories once told beside fires became the sparks of reawakening centuries later. Even when stripped of everything, land, language, rights, people held on to memory. They refused to let the silence win. That's why the attempt to erase history always fails in the long run. Because people are not passive repositories. They're active keepers. Even when scattered by diaspora, disrupted by colonization, or suppressed by systems of power, they find ways to retain what matters. The memory may become fragmented, but it doesn't vanish. And when curiosity, scholarship, or lived experience begins to pull those fragments back together, something incredible happens. A fuller picture begins to emerge. It's not just about recovering facts, it's about recovering meaning. When people reconnect with their buried histories, they reconnect with their voice, their pride, their purpose. They begin to see that they were never as lost as they were made to feel. They begin to reclaim narratives that had been rewritten by outsiders, recentering themselves in the story where they had always belonged. Cultural memory isn't fragile, it's flexible. It bends under pressure, but it doesn't break. That's why even after generations of being told they had no history, many communities are now finding that their pasts were never completely taken. They were simply displaced. And now those displaced truths are coming home. This resurgence isn't accidental. It's the result of individuals refusing to let go of what they felt in their bones was real. It's the result of people listening to the stories behind the stories. It's the work of those who study forgotten languages, reinterpret symbolic traditions, and protect sacred customs not as relics, but as living connections. History buried is not history lost because the human spirit doesn't allow it to be. Somewhere, someone always remembers. Somewhere, someone refuses to forget. And that act of remembrance becomes a rebellion. It becomes a quiet, unstoppable revolution that reconnects people with what was meant to define them, not what was imposed on them. In a world that often measures truth by what is visible or validated by authority, it's easy to dismiss what isn't written in textbooks or sanctioned by institutions. But history lives beyond the pages. It lives in the way people cook, speak, pray, dance, and mourn. It lives in shared intuition, in ancestral dreams, in the language of the heart. And it rises again whenever someone dares to ask, what's missing, what was left out? That question alone is powerful because it doesn't just seek answers, it disrupts the silence. It opens the door for lost stories to return, for hidden voices to be heard, and for a deeper kind of truth to surface, one that's not just factual but felt. So while history may be buried, never believe for a moment that it's lost. It lives. And the search for it, the determination to recover what was taken, isn't just a historical act, it's a healing one. And once begun, it reshapes not only the past but the future as well. Reclaiming erased knowledge is more than just a scholarly pursuit. It is a deeply personal transformational act. It is about reaching into the past, not to live in it, but to retrieve pieces of ourselves that were deliberately taken. It's about asking the questions that others have long avoided. It's about choosing to see the full picture even when parts of it have been painted over. When we seek what was hidden, we do more than uncover lost facts. We reclaim a part of our identity, our power, and our voice. There is a reason knowledge was erased in the first place. It was never about accident or oversight. It was about strategy, about limiting what people knew so they would limit what they believed about themselves. Erased knowledge often involves more than stories or information. It involves a worldview, a sense of place and worth in the grand narrative of human experience. To take that away is to make people forget they were ever more than what their oppressors told them. And to reclaim it is to remind them that their story didn't start with struggle. It started with brilliance, with dignity, with purpose. When knowledge is removed, so too is identity. People lose the connection to their lineage, to their innovations, to the philosophies and truths that once guided their lives. They are made to believe that their culture contributed little, that their people were always behind, always lesser. This kind of erasure breeds not only ignorance but dependency. It convinces people to look outward for validation instead of inward for truth. But the moment someone begins to question the gaps, the moment they ask, why wasn't I taught this, or what else is missing, they begin a journey back to self, because the truth is never entirely destroyed. It lingers, it echoes, it calls out in ancient symbols, in forgotten dialects, in stories passed down in whispers and fragments. And when that call is heard, something within awakens. That is the spark of reclamation. To reclaim erased knowledge is to honor those who were silenced. It's to say, asterisk, you mattered, your voice mattered, and it still does. Asterisk, it's to break cycles of disempowerment by restoring the full spectrum of human experience to those who were taught only one version of it. And in doing so, it liberates not just minds, but spirits. This kind of reclamation is not just for scholars or historians. It's for everyone. It's found in books, yes, but also in family stories, in community rituals, in the rediscovery of art forms, in the unearthing of buried names and achievements. It's the moment someone realizes that their ancestors were creators, leaders, and thinkers long before they were ever colonized or enslaved. That realization shifts everything. When people reclaim knowledge that was erased, they no longer accept the identities assigned to them by others. They stop asking for permission to belong. They walk differently, speak differently, dream differently, because they understand they are part of something ancient, something resilient, something powerful. And that power does not come from external systems. It comes from within. This is why reclamation is revolutionary. It disrupts the comfort of accepted history. It challenges systems that rely on ignorance to maintain order. And most importantly, it empowers people to live fully, with an understanding of where they came from and what they are capable of becoming. Reclaiming erased knowledge is an act of self-love, of collective healing. It's a declaration that we are not who they said we were, that our stories are not small, or shameful, or incomplete. They are vast, rich, and essential. It is saying, asterisk, we see ourselves now, and we will not look away again. Asterisk, in this way, every search for forgotten knowledge becomes an act of rebuilding, not just of history, but of identity, of pride, of future generations, who will grow up not with holes in their understanding, but with bridges to their greatness. Because once you know the truth, once you truly see it, you carry it with you, and no one can take it away again. So reclaim, remember, revive, because what was erased was never truly gone. It was waiting for you. Truth is not fragile. It is not temporary. It does not wither in darkness or disappear when ignored. Truth endures. Even when silenced, even when hidden, even when rewritten, truth remains quietly waiting for the right moment, the right voice, the right mind willing to uncover it. Truth does not die, it waits. In every era there have been efforts to suppress truths that were inconvenient to power. Stories have been stripped from books, cultures have been misrepresented, entire legacies have been reduced to a single narrative that served someone else's interest. But what those in control often fail to understand is that truth isn't confined to ink on paper or words in a classroom. It lives in people. It breathes through memory. It echoes in tradition, in intuition, in the quiet knowing that something deeper exists beneath the surface. And no matter how much effort is made to bury it, truth doesn't disappear. It simply retreats into the spaces where only the curious and the courageous dare to go. It becomes part of the questions that keep us up at night. It flickers in the art that moves us, in the patterns that don't add up, in the tension between what we're told and what we feel. It waits, not because it is powerless, but because it is patient. That's the nature of truth. It outlasts everything that tries to silence it. And eventually someone comes along who asks, what don't they want me to know? That question, simple yet defiant, cracks the surface. And once that crack appears, light starts to get in. Pieces of buried history begin to surface. People start connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. The erased begins to re-emerge, not as something new, but as something long hidden, now seen clearly again. This reawakening is happening all over the world. Individuals are questioning the stories they were taught. Communities are reconnecting with roots they were told to forget. And in that process, people are not just finding facts, they are finding themselves. Because when truth resurfaces, it brings with it a sense of clarity, purpose, and identity that no external system can replicate or erase. Truth's resilience is tied to the human spirit. As long as there are people willing to ask, to challenge, to seek, then truth will never die. It may lie dormant, but it will always rise again through those bold enough to carry its weight. The erasure of knowledge, of identity, of legacy, those are acts of fear, not power. Because the powerful do not need to hide the truth. Only the insecure do. And so truth becomes revolutionary, not because it's new, but because it was hidden. And when revealed, it transforms, it liberates, it builds bridges between the past and the future. It restores voices that were silenced, reclaims names that were lost, and gives depth to identities that had been flattened. The people searching for truth today are not doing so in vain. They are part of a larger movement, a quiet but powerful shift toward awakening. Each book read, each conversation sparked, each memory passed down is a thread in the tapestry of truth being rewoven, and the more who search, the louder the truth becomes. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be put back. Because once seen, truth demands recognition, and that's the gift truth offers, not just knowledge, but transformation. It doesn't just tell you what happened, it shows you who you are. It asks you to live differently, to walk with a greater sense of awareness, to recognize that your story is part of something much bigger than you were led to believe. Truth doesn't die. It waits in the stories untold, the archives unopened, the memories protected. It waits in the courage of the ones who refuse to settle for half answers or hollow explanations. It waits in you. So the question isn't whether truth exists, it's whether you're willing to look for it, whether you're ready to hold it when you find it, whether you're prepared to let it change you. Because once it does, once the truth rises, there's no going back. And that's when the real story begins. You are not here by accident. You are not separate from the stories that came before you. Even if the pages were torn, the lines blurred, the language forgotten. You are the continuation of what was erased, the walking proof that even when systems tried to erase whole histories, they could not erase the people who carried them forward. You are evidence that memory is not so easily destroyed, that lineage is more than blood. It is spirit, resilience, and will. There were efforts to silence, to bury, to overwrite. There were institutions built to make sure you would never know who you truly were or where you truly came from. Names were changed, languages were lost, stories were edited or removed entirely. But none of that could stop the pulse of identity from traveling through generations. It passed through the body, through the rhythm of footsteps, the cadence of laughter, the echoes of wisdom disguised as lullabies or warnings. It is in you, whether you were taught to recognize it or not. You carry things you may not even be fully aware of. The strength of ancestors you've never met. The creativity of minds whose work was never credited. The fire of voices that were never allowed to speak aloud. You are not starting from nothing. You are starting from everything. Everything they tried to take but couldn't. You are the recovery, the reappearance, the resurgence, your curiosity, your drive to know more, to go deeper. That's not random. That's the call of continuation. You are being moved by forces older than you, asking you not to rebuild what was lost, but to continue to take what still lives in fragments and carry it forward. To not let the silence win, to refuse the incomplete version of history you were given, to restore complexity where they gave you simplicity, to expand where they told you to shrink. You are the next chapter, not because you are writing something new out of nothing, but because you are adding your voice to a long silenced conversation. You are the unfinished sentence finally being completed, the withheld story now being spoken. And that comes with both a gift and a responsibility. The gift is power, an understanding of yourself that goes beyond surface-level identity. It's the ability to see yourself as part of a long arc of survival, brilliance, struggle, and joy. It's knowing that you didn't begin with trauma. You began with greatness, and the trauma came later. You were never meant to forget that. The responsibility is to carry it with intention, to protect what remains, to share what you uncover, to ask the questions others are afraid to pass on what you learn in your own way, in your work, your art, your parenting, your presence. The way you live becomes part of the recovery. Every step forward you take is a step away from erasure and toward remembrance. This is not about dwelling in the past. It's about building a future rooted in truth, a future where no one else has to grow up disconnected from who they really are, a future where stories are told fully, not in fragments, where history is honored, not hidden. And you're part of making that happen, whether you realize it yet or not. You are the evidence that they failed, that no matter how many pages were burned or rewritten, the story didn't end. You are the part they couldn't control, the truth they couldn't contain. The fact that you're here thinking, seeking, reclaiming, means the erasure was never complete. So what now? You live, you ask, you learn, you remember, you teach, you listen, you challenge, you preserve, you create. You become the safe place for others to find their truth. You become the living archive, the generational bridge, the active participant in a legacy too big to be contained in any one era. You are not disconnected. You are not broken. You are the continuation. You are the breath after the silence. You are the ink returning to the page, the rhythm returning to the drum. You are what they didn't expect to survive, but here you are, not erased, never forgotten, just waiting to rise, and now you do.